I would now like to invite Fran Sheldon to come speak with us. Could you please tell us your name and your professional qualifications?
Fran Sheldon, I'm a river ecologist and I'm a member of the Australian Rivers Institute at Griffith University.
Could you talk to us about the impacts of irrigation on the Darling River system since European colonisation?
Yep. Okay, so as a river ecologist, I've been working on the Darling in an ecological context since 1990 with a number of different projects. And what I wanted to do today was take a much broader spatial look at the impacts of flow diversions and irrigated agriculture on the Darling. So rather than just going down into quite detailed numbers, to take a landscape perspective to what we're actually seeing. So this is just to put it in perspective around variability, one of the things that I think we get captured by in terms of looking at some flow statistics in rivers like the Darling is just how variable it is. So back in the 1990s, we did a project trying to come up with a context, sorry, I'm just going to cough, for how variable some of Australia's rivers are. We took 20-year hydrographs from a range of different rivers all around the world and then looked at how measuring the variability of those hydrographs, and this is just a plot of the coefficient of variation, which just standardises that measure across all of those rivers. And you'll see the first 7 rivers, of all of those, 5 of them are Australian rivers, and you can see where the Darling sits there in red. The 2 most variable rivers in the world were the Cooper and the Diamantina. And if you look on that plot, I've got another river, the Sear Darrier, marked out, and that will become apparent as to why we'll look at that towards the end. But the Darling is a highly variable river in a world context. So if you're thinking about some of the water management and the water planning that has gone in the Murray-Darling Basin as a whole, the early days were really just a River Murray story. So a lot of the significant things sort of pivoted around the Federation drought that really started to focus people's thoughts around water sharing. And it was actually the reason that really sharpened Federation when Victoria and New South Wales were having a bit of a standoff over the River Murray. So the first major agreement was 1915 on the River Murray Waters Agreement, and that then established the River Murray Commission. And the Darling was pretty much left out of most planning right through till well into the 60s. So the first realisation, I guess, at a basin scale that water was an issue was in '68 when South Australia put a cap on its diversions. The issues in the Darling really came to the fore in the 80s and caused the old River Murray Commission was broadened to be the Murray-Darling Basin Agreement was signed and it became the Murray-Darling Basin Commission. Then the cap on water diversions in '95, and then in the 2000s we've had a run of different things leading up to the Basin Plan in 2012. So just the Darling story, again, really nothing until 1968 when the Menindee Lake storage was constructed and completed. And then you really don't get much happening in the Darling until the 1980s when there really was a massive expansion of cotton irrigation. Leading then into the mid-90s, there was quite a bit of effort in water resource planning throughout the Northern Basin. Unregulated flow management plan for the northern rivers, the scientific expert panels placed in the northern rivers, and then a lot of water allocation management plans in the Queensland tributaries. And post the basin plan for the northern basin, there's been the sustainable diversion limit adjustment where they're sort of looking at exactly how much water can be diverted. So that's, I guess, some of the context for water planning. Cotton, as we know, has really taken off since the 1980s, but that graph really just shows how much it has increased even into the late 2000s. Just the irrigated area in hectares and the number of farms irrigating cotton. And on the map on the side, you'll see the sort of locations of the cotton growing areas. They're in the lowland parts and on the floodplain parts of the river. And just keep an eye on that because the next slide I'm going to show has got the actual natural swamps and wetlands. So the Murray-Darling Basin's a little bit strange. It doesn't flow to any particular large permanent water body. The inland river basins are all like combinations of channels and complex wetlands. And if you look at what's highlighted on that map, you'll see that many of the tributaries actually end in a complex floodplain. So things like the Guida wetlands are the flood out part of the Guida before it actually meets the main channel. Macquarie Marshes, it does the same. You've got the lower Balloon floodplain and the Narran Lakes complex, and that needs to fill with water before it actually goes and reaches through to the Barwon-Darling system. The Warrego floodplain, the same. And further west, the Paru floodplain flows out into a massive sort of floodplain water bodies and wetlands before very occasionally it spills into the Darling just upstream of Wilcannia. And the whole thing sort of terminates in Menindee Lakes, which naturally would have been a cascading series of lakes with permanent to very ephemeral lakes that the water would have filled up before the Darling continued on down the main channel and the Anna branch. So the whole system was this complex balance of ephemeral water bodies. So those wetlands function very much like sponges, fill and spill with these sequential floods that come through. So there's just some pictures that are a bit blurry of some of those wetlands. So if you look at some of the hydrographs, and this is from a very old Notes of History of the Darling River that I've been dragging around for a while, you'll see if you look at the hydrograph of rivers like the Darling, particularly the Lake Eyre Basin rivers, that the floods tend to occur in sequences. You get a cluster of floods and then a period of dry and then a cluster of floods. And those flood clustering really relates to the La Nina cycles of ENSO. And so you'll even see since 1989 on the Darling, the hydrographs of Wilcannia and Burke, you do have those series of floods, and they do relate quite strongly to the La Nina phase. And that's really important. So what I'm going to show you now is my really bad graphics of how those sequences of floods work through those ephemeral water bodies, which are acting like sponges. So if you've got a dry time throughout this system, no flow, and then you get a small flood coming through. Now, the first thing, most of the rainfall is driven from the upper catchment because it's where the monsoonal incursions come down. It's the headwaters, it's the higher part. It fills those first water bodies around Narran Lakes, the lower Condamine floodplain. As the flood moves on, if you get a flood again in the next year and no water's taken out, those water bodies are already wet. So the water gets to push further through the system. And then if you get another flood in that sequence, it will push further through the system down into the Menindee Lakes and then beyond into South Australia. So those sequences of floods are really important for the whole landscape hydrology of the system. So when you put irrigation on top of that, you actually change the whole way those floodplain wetlands are actually working in terms of being sponges. So if we just run through my bad graphics again, the water's actually pumped out in the northern basin after the first flood because it needs to fill the off-stream water bodies, which are the squares, the off-stream storages. And so the second year, it will flood, and again, more water can be pumped out. Now, of course, if the second year flood's really big or the first year flood's really big, some of the water does get through. I'm a bit catastrophic with my graphics, but most of the water tends to get stuck in the system, and the floodplain water bodies downstream don't tend to get the water, and the water never seems to move down. So this is why when you start looking at things like the dry spells, as you move further down the system, and so on the x-axis, the bottom of this graph, you've got Mungandai, which is way up in the top, down to Wilcannia at the bottom. The period of dry spells gets longer as you go down because the water gets stuck in the upper part of the catchment and just doesn't get through. So this has got lots of words on it. Don't worry about the ones on the left. I'll go through those in a sec. One of the things that, the other part of variability in river systems is that you need the whole suite. You can't just get stuck with the big flows, you need the small flows and the in-channel small, moderate and large floods as well as the overbank flows for the whole system to work. So if you look at the next figure, this is the a modelled pre-developed data with baseline conditions for current development over the same 5-year period. And the blue is the pre-developed model data. And you can just see that the big events are still going to happen. The magnitude is decreased, and that decrease relates to the amount of water diverted, with some of it held in upstream storages. But where you really get impacts in the Darling is you get the small in-channel flows and the moderate flows are completely removed from the hydrology, and the hydrograph becomes flat. So what does that impact? So the small in-channel flows are really required to maintain fish and invertebrate populations and to mediate water quality. They keep the system in water quality, blue-green algal blooms get decreased. The moderate in-channel flows are to do with connectivity. Fish populations can move and you can actually get connection and small-scale breeding events. And on that slide, you'll see out to the right the river mussel, Alatharia jacksoni, which was very common in the Darling, in the trunk of the Darling between Brewarrina and Menindee. In vast parts, I suspect it is now regionally extinct. It wouldn't have survived the really dry times that we've had in the last couple of years. That mussel can't tolerate drying at all. It needs permanent water. And with the river around Wilcannia being pretty much dry for quite some time, I suspect those populations have gone extinct. And if you actually stand on the bank of the river on the Darling and you see the size of the indigenous middens along the bank, you realise the volume or the biomass of mussels that would have occurred in the system, and most of them are Aletharia, and I think you'd be struggling to find one. And the large in-channel pulses, again, mass fish movement and breeding events within channel, and our overland flows are where we actually get large-scale water breeding, fish breeding, and maintenance of a lot of the fish food chain in terms of zooplankton. Okay, and the impacts of wetland drying with not getting any water into them, of course, are felt most profoundly during times of drought. And it's not just surface water drying, it's also soil moisture drying. The longer those wetlands stay dry, the more water it takes to actually get them wet again. So you actually get a compounded effect. It's not even as if it's just got not water, the whole soil profile gets dried. So I just wanted to put this in context of something, and I guess a story that we all know and that is globally recognised as an environmental catastrophe, and that's the Aral Sea. So the Aral Sea was formerly one of the largest permanent lakes in the world, and it's now been, it's basically been reduced to a series of disconnected lakes. Vast areas are now dry, and there's major environmental consequences associated with the demise of that inland permanent water body. And it, as we all know, was a victim of irrigation diversions. Now remember back to my first slide about variability. The Sid area is one of the main rivers that flowed into the Aral Sea, and the Sid area is not very variable. It's quite permanent and quite permanent flow, even though it's flowing through a semi-arid area. What happens with variability? So the Murray-Darling is really our Aral Sea. So it's just not visually obvious because it's not permanent water, it's ephemeral water bodies. And because our lakes are ephemeral, we don't realise the actual loss of water within the systems because we're used to seeing them dry at a certain period of time. So if you look at the, that's a very bad little graph over there, apologies for my low font. That's the Aral Sea on the left and the Murray-Darling Basin on the right. So the diversion out of the Aral Sea, if you play around, I mean the numbers, it's always hard to get an exact number, is about 52% over the mean, and in the Murray-Darling Basin it's about 44%. So we're not too far behind the absolute environmental catastrophe that was the Aral Sea, diverting on average 44%. The problem with the Murray-Darling Basin is that that is 44% of the long-term mean flow, and most years we don't have mean flow. So in many years the diversions are actually more than the inflow. So it's even more catastrophic than diverting 50% of a permanent flowing river system. So thank you. That was my broad landscape scale impacts of hydrology.
Thank you very much, Fran. Does the panel have any questions?
Yeah, thank you. That was actually, for a non-scientist, a very helpful, very excellent presentation. Even I understood the graphy bits, so well done. Can I just ask, in terms of what our First Peoples have been talking about, and I think what other community members will talk about shortly, the impact of irrigation for particular crops has been more devastating than others. In the work that you've been doing, would you say that it's cotton that has been largely responsible for drying out, or do you see a number of different causes for what we're seeing, what some people are calling the death of the Darling River?
I mean, cotton is the major crop that's grown in irrigation in the northern basin, so it's obviously the major culprit. But any kind of diversion, it doesn't matter what they're growing. If you're diverting the water, it wouldn't matter what they were growing with that water, it would cause the same impact. So it's not necessarily cotton per se, it's the diversion of water that's caused the hydrological problem, and then that's have consequent ecological problems as well.
Based on where things are at the moment and the actual continual levels of diversion of water, do you see the future for the Darling River and Menindee Lakes area as one that may not recover? Or what are people projecting, what are scientists projecting will happen to these ecosystems?
Without water, no. I mean, without water, it'll just become like a river desert. I mean, it will flow sometimes because the water, they can't take all the water. In really big flood years, the water will still come down. Whether there's sustainable populations of in-channel fauna is another thing. I think also riparian vegetation is going to really take a hit from, especially in that trunk of the Darling, from just above Burke all the way down to Menindee. And I do suspect that once those red gums have gone, we're going to be looking at an even bigger catastrophe, because there's no recruitment at all. And many of those red gums are very old now along the banks. And I mean, the in-channel flows actually provide riparian water to the red gums, which they do need. And many of them are not in a good condition. So, you know, you've got a very narrow line of riparian habitat on that system naturally. So it's basically 1 or 2 red gums thick. And if they go, then you've got no root mass holding the banks or anything. So whenever there's a flood, the potential for erosion is massive. And so it just becomes compounding.
Mm. Thank you. Does anyone else have questions? No. I think we're all a bit freaked out.
Sorry.
But not from you, just from what's going on. Thank you so much. Thank you.